a kind of condensation of some of the concerns of the Black Panthers. Actually, we see the making the kind of distinction between revolution and reform. We also see the emphasis on the capacity for armed self-defense. There's a mythology about the Black Panther Party that they were especially violent. They weren't. But the capacity to use force to defend themselves was a kind of a hugely important part of their political ideology. And as I say here, it's something which they take from Mao. This idea that political power flows from the barrel of a gun was something which they took from their reading of Chairman Mao. We also see in this speech the connections which Hampton makes, which we've talked about throughout the course when we've been talking about the Black Panthers, which he makes between the struggle of African Americans and the struggle of what were referred to at the time as third world countries engaging in decolonial struggle. So he talks about Angola, for example, in that speech, and he talks about armed resistance within that particular historical context, and he's linking the Black Panther Party to the struggles of national independence around the world. And we see other moments in the film. We're not going to watch all of them, but we see moments in the film, for example, when Hampton negotiates truces between different rival gangs in Chicago, which is something that he did and which was something that made him especially dangerous for the in the eyes of the FBI. This capacity to unify African American groups under one banner and to organize effectively with a unifying ideology was something that the governments in question were very much concerned about, and which they continue to be concerned about with regard to Fred Hampton and the Black Panther Party in general. And we also finally see the importance of community projects. We see the breakfast program, we see education facilities, and we see in the final section of the film, which we'll talk about in a little bit, we see the medical clinic, which Hampton insists that the group should set up and organize in Chicago in order to benefit a community which does not have access to proper healthcare. And the other side of this, of the Panther ideology that we see in the film, is also what's called COINTELPRO, or the counterintelligence program, which the U.S. government, most notably the FBI, developed as a way of disrupting the activity of the Black Panthers, who were a domestic revolutionary organization. The title of the film itself is taken from J. Edgar Hoover, who was the head of the FBI at the time the film was made and is most associated with establishing the FBI and its aims with regard to domestic security. And the film immediately at its start repeats two claims which Hoover made with regard to the Black Panther Party, one of which is that it represented the single greatest domestic threat to American national security, and the other was that one of the primary imperatives, or one of the most important things that COINTELPRO had to do, was to prevent, that should say prevent, not present. I'm going to correct that now because it's important. To prevent the rise of a Black Messiah So of someone who was capable of unifying African Americans within a shared political movement, which is what we see Fred Hampton doing in the film. And Fred Hampton was most often read as the closest figure to this Black Messiah. But it's important, and we'll talk about this again, but it's important to note now that this is Hoover's term. This is a term that the enemies of the Black Panther Party used. It is not a term that would ever have been applied by Hampton himself or by any member of the Black Panther Party, and we'll talk about why that is in a little bit. But I think it's significant when we watch this film from a post-colonial perspective, and when you think about maybe its politics and the limitations of its politics. Something which is important is that it takes its title and, in some ways, its narrative frame or its narrative arc from J. Edgar Hoover's descriptions. It doesn't take it from a Black Panther Party statement. And within the film, we see the strategies that the FBI used to disrupt the Panthers. So we see forged documents, we see informants, we see both O'Neill and the other informant, who we find out later in the film is responsible for the murder and torture of Alex Rackley, who was an individual who was killed in quite a brutal way. It's not actually historically definitively known that the person who killed him, or the person responsible for his killing, was an informant. However, it does look as if they were. And something that we can add to this is that these strategies, the things we see being conducted against the Panthers, against the Black Panther Party, this actually historically provides a degree of support for one of their own central arguments, which is that there is a direct relationship between the military force which is used overseas in order to disrupt insurgency in other countries such as Vietnam, Korea, and Central America, and the way that domestic policing and domestic control works. And we can see that in this image here, which is taken from the Black Panther Party magazine and was made by Emory Douglas, who was who was the primary artist of the Black Panther Party magazine and who was its Minister of Culture. And we see this kind of direct link between the Marines, the National Guard, and the local police. The idea is that the kind of military repressive force which was first seen in terms of domestic policing in dealing with the Black Panther Party is the same kind of repressive force that we see in colonial wars that America is fighting at the time. And this, as we've said a few times, allows one to also create a relationship, or to imagine a relationship, between people living in a situation of internal colonization and people living in a situation of more traditional colonization, in which they are subject to military aggression from an outside country. We're not going to watch too much of the film, but I want to draw attention to critical perspectives that we can have on it. One of which comes from No Name, who was a Chicago-based rapper who was invited to do a song from the soundtrack of the film, but who declined. And when she declined to provide a song for the soundtrack, she said the following. She said, "It was shot beautifully. This is the film. The acting was amazing. But it's a movie about an informant. Fred is secondary, and radical communist politics are not centered at all." And I want to dwell on this criticism because I think it's true, but I also think it takes a while to see it, because we do see quite a lot of Fred Hampton in the movie. We do hear quite a lot of his words, and we do hear echoes and repetitions of things that Fred Hampton was recorded as saying. So there is a sense that we do get some of his political message and some of the political messages of the Black Panther Party. But I agree with the sense that it's not centered. It's not the heart of the movie. It's not really what the movie is about. Rather, what the movie is about is O'Neill, and becomes a story about about the psychology of betrayal, and it becomes a story about an individual, and an individual who is placed in a difficult situation. And we see this in the way that the film treats O'Neill as the protagonist, and also as the person who in some way is consistently making decisions. So the moments of tension in the film in which we see that O'Neill could either do one thing or another, and chooses to do a certain thing, that's traditionally a way in which we can define a protagonist as someone whose agency affects the outcome of the film. It's always O'Neill, and it's almost never Hampton. And even in moments in which the politics of Fred Hampton appears to be foregrounded, that's actually happening in a way which draws attention much more to the psychological struggles of O'Neill than it does to the actual content of what Hampton is saying. And we can see that in one of the speeches, in which, after Hampton has just come out of jail, he gives a speech. So we'll watch it from around here, from around 116. And he gives a speech in which he continues to affirm himself as a revolutionary leader. And look at the way that this scene is cut between the way it focuses on Hampton, it focuses on O'Neill, and it focuses on the FBI agent who has been responsible for recruiting O'Neill and blackmailing him into infiltrating the Black Panthers and becoming the Judas of the film's title.
If you're there to struggle, you're there to win. If you're there not struggling, goddammit, you don't deserve to win. Put a fist in the air for Comrade Jimmy Palmer. Jimmy Palmer. That a revolutionary deed.
So notice the way in which O'Neill becomes the focus of the scene, and O'Neill's state of indecision becomes a focus of the scene, because we know that he is someone who is not truly committed. We know that he's a traitor. We know that he will betray Hampton, and the scene becomes about his psychology.
He stood face to face and toe to toe with Pierre Daly's henchmen and made the greatest sacrifice one could ever make.
And there we see the agent who recruited him. So again, we get much more of a sense that it becomes about becomes about O'Neill's internal struggle, we can say.
I don't believe I'm gonna die in no car, Red. I don't believe I'm gonna die slipping on no ice. I don't believe I'm gonna die because I got a bad heart. I believe I'm gonna die doing what I was born for. I believe I'm gonna die half the people. I'm gonna die for the people because I live for the people. I live for the people because I love the people. And that's for them bloodthirsty, murderous pigs. Well, some of you might be in the audience right now, huh? Sitting on a table coat, gun in your hand. Well, let me make it plain. Kill a few pigs, get a little satisfaction. Wait on. Kill some more pigs, get some more satisfaction. Get them all your complete satisfaction. It's not a question of violence or non-violence. It's a question of resistance to fascism or non-existence within fascism. You can murder a liberator, but you can't murder liberation. You can murder a revolutionary, but you can't murder revolution. And you can murder a freedom fighter, but you can't murder freedom.
So it becomes almost a scene of dramatic irony. This is what the focus of the scene is. It becomes about O'Neill's emotional state, even though Hampton's appears to be the focus. The way that the plot is constructed is leading us towards a concern and almost a sympathy with O'Neill, which is not to say that the filmmakers think that O'Neill is at all a good character, but the dramatic tension in the scene is stemming from the fact that we know that O'Neill is an informant and we know that the person who recruited him is there. I also don't think it's a coincidence that the filmmakers chose to include one of the more violent speeches that Hampton made. It's not, he made many other speeches which they could have included. There is a sense, I think, that this is playing into slightly assumptions about the Panthers which could easily be challenged in terms of how prone to aggression they were viewed as being. It's actually, like I say, self-defense was a very important part of the ideology, but at least throughout the majority of the time that they were an active political organization, then the kind of things that we see Hampton talking about here were only a very minimal part of the discourse. But the essential point that I want to make is that when the film is shot in this way, it becomes framed as a scene in which O'Neill is the most interesting part. The most interesting part of Hampton's story is the fact you can use it to tell the story of an informant, of someone who is conflicted and who faces a moral and existential dilemma. And I want to say that I think that that's a political choice on the part of the filmmakers, because not everyone in this film faces that kind of dilemma. We see people who are perfectly willing to make committed political decisions and serious sacrifices as a result of that, and who do not experience a degree of ambiguity. And when we make that the focus of the film, I think that we also, or when that is made the focus of the film, I think that it also creates a sense of something like inevitability to Hampton's death. It creates a sense that the politics become less important, like No Name says. They're not centered. And this, in and of itself, feeds into a kind of narrative that those politics are no longer relevant, and that what is most interesting about the story is the psychological story of William O'Neill, which again I think is something that I would suggest reflects a political decision on the part of the filmmakers and is evidence of their own political perspective. And especially from a post-colonial perspective, we can see this as perhaps suggesting a movement away from a real commitment to what's being shown and a treatment of the story as if it were a interesting historical episode rather than something which has immediate relevance for the world in which we live. And again, there's another scene, something which happens throughout the film is a focus on individuals making individual decisions, which is something which is certainly not the only way in which one can make a political film, and it's something which in some way or another goes against the ideology of collective emancipation, which is what we're thinking about if we think about the Black Panthers. So we can watch this scene in which it's around 128. Let me find it. In which we see a member of the Black Panthers shooting a police officer.
Please, no.
And again, that's a scene which recalls cinematic depictions of war. It's clearly intended to express a kind of ethical message that violence is dehumanizing, and that the individual that we see in the scene has the choice about whether or not to shoot the police officer, and he chooses to shoot him and is then shot himself. So there's a kind of ethical lesson in this scene to do with individual responsibility and to do with the sense that individuals themselves are in some way dehumanized by the kind of violence that they participate in, and that they no longer see each other as people, but they see each other as either cops or revolutionaries, say as members of an opposing army. Again, I don't want to say that that's a bad ethical lesson. I don't want to say that violence is good. But I also think it's significant that there's a focus on the individual always. There are few representations of the collective in this film. And this is one of the most it's a memorable scene. It's a scene which doesn't need to be in the film, and it's a scene which appears like it's carrying quite a specific, almost quite universal moral lesson. And again, I feel like that's a political choice on the part of the filmmakers to foreground those kinds of individual decisions, rather than focus on a kind of collective agency. And we can end by thinking about the way in which the entire frame of the film encourages this too. So, like I mentioned, we shouldn't forget the fact that the term Black Messiah came from J. Edgar Hoover, and that it was not a term which any member of the Black Panther Party would ever have applied to Hampton or anyone at all. And the reason for that is because messiahs are individuals necessarily, and they're individuals who save people who, in some sense or another, are passive. So people who need someone to save them. And the essence of the Black Panther Party's politics and their political analysis is that what is much more important than someone who can save people is encouraging people to organize and to realize their own collective agency, so their own capacity to save themselves and to change and grow through action and through personal development. And the other thing that the Messiah frame does, or another thing the Messiah frame does, is posit Hampton as a kind of martyr. So, as someone whose life is fulfilled by the act of dying. So, someone who, in some way, needed to die in order for their message to come across, or in order for the meaning of their life to realize itself. We get this sense in the film that Hampton is doomed. And it's not just because a lot of us would know that he died before watching it. It's also it's built into the arc of the film and into the title of the film. Messiahs die; they don't survive the end. And this is foregrounded towards the final scene, in which we see Hampton making a kind of willing sacrifice. So he refuses to accept the money which has been collected for him, and to flee to Algeria, or to go to a different country which would support him. The Panthers did receive active solidarity from international sources, including Algeria and Cuba, sources or places with whom they themselves declared their solidarity, also sheltered high-profile Black Panther Party members and helped them evade arrest and evade prison. But if we see this scene, we see there's something of a sense of a Last Supper, I think, in this scene. This final meeting of the comrades before Hampton is inevitably killed. But Hampton's death was not inevitable. It was the product of police violence, which needn't have happened necessarily. So we should pay attention to the way in which the film generates a kind of tragic feeling, which on the one hand means that the writers are very sympathetic to Fred Hampton, but on the other hand makes his death necessary in a way which it needn't be.
It's easy to see. Doc, you run it. Name it after Jake. So when people hear the name Jake Winters, they think about healing and loving, like he loved us. And when I get out, me and Deb can have a second. And third.
And again, we have O'Neill, who is positioned as a Judas figure in this scene, as someone who knows that he's going to betray the Messiah. And we also see Hampton making a willing sacrifice. So Hampton, he doesn't know that he's going to die at this point, but we see him giving the money back so that they can build a clinic instead of use that money for him to leave the country and avoid prison. So he chooses to go to prison for the sake of other people. So he makes a kind of messianic sacrifice. But the problem with that is that sacrifice, in order for it to work and in order for it to have the meaning that it has in the film, means that he needs to die. So again, what I want to stress is that the framing of the movie, the way that it works, the way that it's generating a sense of sadness and pathos in this, is through making Fred Hampton's death a necessary consequence of who he was. By making him the Messiah, you mean that you don't engage necessarily politically with the fact that he didn't have to die, that his death was a result of conscious actions which could have been different. Instead, you get a kind of tragic pathos from this sense that he was someone who sacrificed himself, which, wasn't true. And again, posits him as an individual much more than it presents the possibility of collective agency. And we also, if we just skip back a bit, here we go. We also see O'Neill being presented as Judas, like I just said. But we see definite scenes in which a kind of situation of damnation is suggested for O'Neill, and also the scene in which he receives payment. Both of these are reminiscent of a Judas type character. So this scene, what I want to argue is that the figure who gives him the sleeping powder that he's told to put in Hampton's drink has a kind of demonic quality. It feels like he's come out of somewhere very uncertain, and he's here to really kind of claim the soul of William O'Neill, provided that he goes through with this final action.
Top me off while I run to the ladies. Alienness.
Shit. They let niggas work for the FBI now? That's right, huh? Why don't you give me an application, brother? Mr. FBI man. Huh?
Hey, man, you shut the fuck up.
Hey.
God damn it.
Mitchell warned me about you. Yeah.
What?
Look here, just relax. Okay, we hiding in plain sight. Nobody know we in here. Check this out, man. I got this article I want you to read, right? Yeah, right? It's an article in this paper. Very important. I need you to let the chairman read it tomorrow night. Put that in this drink.
I don't know what the fuck you talking about, man. Fuck out of here with that shit.
My mistake.
Articles and shit, man.
No, it's all good. That's my mistake. No, I guess I had the wrong guy. Sorry about that. Get out of here.
Hey! Who are you, man?
Hey, don't worry about it, Slick, man. Just go back inside.
Nigga, I'm not gonna poison him. You hear me? You fucking hear me?
Come on, man. You watch too many movies. Look, all it's gonna do is just make him sleepy. You want him to go easy, right?
Who the fuck are you, man? Tell me your fucking name. You know, did Roy send you? If you a fan, then show me a fucking badge. Hey! Show me a fucking badge, man, please.
So yeah, I think this scene does two. I mean, it works to represent the sense that O'Neill is in kind of a psychological trap, and it also that the figure who gives him the sleeping powder is presented as deliberately surreal. He's almost an otherworldly kind of messenger, which again is giving a kind of mythical quality to the narrative as it's taking place. All of which is prioritizing this arc that we see in the film and O'Neill's own psychological struggle much more than what we might call the politics of the events which are happening. And the final scene I want to watch is the scene in which O'Neill receives payment, which again is very like Judas, who in the Bible is paid 40 pieces of silver for betraying Jesus.
You don't have to if you don't want to, but I think you'll be glad you did. There's a gas station in Maywood. It's yours. There's a lot of money in gas, consistent money, legal money. You own your own business now, Bill. You're free. What do you need? You need a drink?
No, I don't need that.
You need a drink? Excuse me. Can you get this man a scotch?
So again, we see him as a kind of Judas figure, as someone who has betrayed a Messiah and who now feels deeply guilty and is kind of broken by the fact of what he's done and what's happened as a result of it. But at the same time, I want to argue that the film has made the decision to prioritize this kind of psychological reading and to see the conflict and the drama of Fred Hampton's story within this kind of psychology. You know, like No Name says, it's a film about an informant. It's not really a film about Fred Hampton, and it's not really a film which is committed to the relevance of the politics of the Black Panther Party, which I think is something which, again, we talked about how in What's with Bashir, there's almost an unconscious replication of certain kinds of colonial ideologies at the end. And within this film, I think I would say that there's definitely, while it's a film which tells the history of, or tells a history of very radical left politics, it's in and of itself, the film, the way its message and the way that its narrative works serves to undermine the kind of post-colonial critiques that the characters within it are making. And I hope that I've given you some sense of the way in which that works and why it is that I think that. Okay, guys, so see you next week. Get in touch if you have any questions about the presentations or about the written assignment. And yeah, take care. Bye.